High in the Peruvian Andes, where the air is razor-thin and death lurks in every shadow, two climbers stood on the peak of the impossible. Joe Simpson and Simon Yates had just conquered Siula Grande, a 20,814-foot colossus of ice and rock. The mountain was feared even by seasoned climbers. It was remote, untouched, and merciless. Few had dared to scale its deadly face, and even fewer had returned to tell the tale. But in the mountains, getting to the top is only half the battle. They were exhausted, their bodies pushed to the brink after days of climbing, but there was no time to celebrate. The descent would be just as treacherous, perhaps even more so. Snow swirled around them, and the wind screamed across the ridgeline, cutting through their clothing like shards of ice. The weather was turning. They had to move, now. Joe planted his crampons into the ice, testing each step as they carefully descended. Their plan was to take the safest route possible, but in the mountains, safe is relative. Every step could be a death sentence. One misplaced foot, one loose rock, one unexpected gust of wind. And then, it happened. Joe shifted his weight forward, expecting solid ground beneath him. Instead, his boots slipped. The world flipped upside down. The ice axe tore from his grip. He tumbled, helpless, spinning, flailing, sliding. Then the snap. A sickening, unnatural crack rang through the thin air, followed by a lightning bolt of agony shooting up his leg. The world blurred, his vision narrowing, as the pain sent shockwaves through his body. He came to a stop, gasping, his breath ragged and desperate. Something was very wrong. Simon scrambled toward him, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Joe! Are you okay?" Joe already knew the answer. He looked down at his leg. The bone had shattered. The tibia had snapped clean through, piercing the skin in a jagged mess of blood and ice. His leg was useless. A death sentence at this altitude. Panic clawed at his mind. A broken leg in these conditions, on this mountain, meant one thing: he would not survive. Simon knew it too. He knelt beside Joe, his face unreadable. For a long moment, the two climbers stared at each other, the brutal truth sinking in. And then, against all odds, Simon made a decision that defied all logic. He refused to leave Joe behind. They devised a desperate plan. Simon would lower Joe down the mountain, 300 feet at a time, using their single rope. It was madness. It was suicide. But it was their only chance. For hours, Simon braced himself against the howling wind, gripping the rope with raw, frozen hands. Joe dangled helplessly, every movement sending fresh waves of agony through his shattered leg. But they kept going. The storm raged around them, turning the world into a swirling void of white. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Their muscles screamed in protest. Their bodies begged for rest. Then, disaster. Joe unknowingly slid over the edge of a hidden cliff. He dropped, suddenly weightless, the rope yanking tight around his harness. He was now dangling in midair. Below him, nothing but empty space. He had no way to climb back up. Above, Simon had no idea. All he knew was that the rope had gone tight, too tight. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Simon's strength was failing. His fingers numb. His arms weak. The weight was too much. Joe was pulling him down. If Simon held on any longer, they would both die. The choice was impossible. Hold on, and die. Or cut the rope. With hands trembling from exhaustion, from the cold, from the sheer horror of what he was about to do, Simon reached for his knife. One movement. One impossible decision. The blade sliced through the rope. Joe plummeted. The wind roared in his ears as he fell into the darkness. Then silence. Simon sat there, gripping the severed rope, his mind numb. Joe was gone. There was no way anyone could survive that fall. He was dead. With no other choice, Simon continued down alone, haunted by the weight of his decision. But Joe was not dead. He awoke in a deep crevasse, a frozen tomb of ice and shadow. His body was wrecked. His leg was useless. There was no way out. For a long moment, he simply lay there, staring up at the walls of ice surrounding him. This was how it ended. But something inside him refused. Not like this. Summoning a strength that made no sense, Joe began to crawl. He clawed his way toward a sliver of light, inch by inch, his fingers raw and bleeding. The pain was beyond anything he had ever known. It didn't matter. He kept moving. Hours passed. Then more. Reaching the surface. The nightmare was not over. Before him stretched miles of frozen wasteland. Base camp was out there. Somewhere. With no food. No water. No strength left in his body. He crawled. Through the ice. Through the snow. Through the agony that begged him to stop. His mind slipped. Hallucinations took over. Voices whispered in his ears. Figures moved in the corners of his vision. But he wouldn't stop. For 3 days and 3 nights he crawled through a world of endless white. Then, on the 4th day, he saw it. A dark shape in the distance. Base camp. Simon was there. Hours away from leaving. Joe had one chance. With the last whisper of strength in his body, he screamed. A raw, desperate, inhuman sound. Inside the tent, Simon froze. It was impossible. He ran outside, scanning the wasteland. And then, he saw him, a broken figure crawling through the snow. A man who had crawled out of hell itself to survive. Simon ran to him, dropping to his knees beside his friend. Joe had done the impossible. He spared his life with only few moments left.